Good evening. Before discussing where BDS will be in the next 5 to 10 years, as we are coming close to the 10th anniversary of the BDS movement, I thought I would start with introducing the philosophy behind BDS, why we've done it. Any human rights movement ideally seeks to raise public awareness, to shape public opinion, and mobilize thoughtful strategic action to reach its goals. In doing so, pragmatic considerations often challenge or even conflict with ethical principles. Negotiating these perceived contradictions is at the heart of what effective human rights campaigning entails. Pedagogy, as understood by the late Brazilian educator Paulo Freire as the philosophy of education, is therefore very relevant in informing internal and external awareness building, and is therefore quite consequential in affecting, if not helping to shape, the ultimate outcomes of this campaigning. A critical pedagogy of liberation from colonial and other forms of oppression needs to address many dimensions, depending on the particular circumstances of oppression. But regardless of particularity, I think the following three notions may be common denominators in most circumstances, at least for the BDS movement. They're very essential. First, ethicality. The question is how to resist oppression, to maximize the possibility of rights, while minimizing the possibility of unduly harming the oppressor community, unjustly or unduly harming the oppressor community. A very tough ethical question that the oppressed always have to deal with. How can resistance pave the way towards ethical divorce or ethical coexistence? After ending the conditions and structures of oppression, one way that the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire mentions is how to humanize both communities in rejecting and resisting the dehumanization of the oppressed can liberate both, can humanize both, the oppressed and the oppressors. One concept that's related to this ethicality of resistance is rejecting the trap of collective responsibility. In other words, if we divide the world into us versus them, the two tribes, then if somebody from the other tribe does an unjust thing to someone from my tribe, then the whole tribe is responsible. That type of tribalism, that type of dichotomy, the Bush Jr., us versus them, very philosophically deep concept, Bush Jr. I mean, Plato and Bush Jr. must be out there among the most important philosophers. Anyway, I think rejecting that dichotomy is very important to maintain the ethicality of resistance and having the possibility of ethical coexistence, as I said, or ethical divorce. In the BDS movement, for example, this concept is very important to us. In the BDS call itself, there was an appeal to conscientious Israelis, that is Jewish Israelis, to join us in the struggle, in the BDS struggle, to end the three forms of Israel's injustice: the occupation of 1967 territory, the apartheid system, and the denial of refugee rights. The second notion that is important to us is decolonizing the mind of the oppressed. To talk about this just very, very briefly, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, one of the most important Zionist ideologues in the pre-state era, as far back as the 1920s, wrote a very short essay called The Iron Wall. And I'll just quote from Jabotinsky because he really captures what colonizing the mind of the native means. He says, "It is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. The native populations, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage." And then he concludes, "Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. And that iron wall to Jabotinsky meant first and foremost removing hope. He argued that as long as the native populations have any hope of getting rid of the colonists, they will continue rejecting the status quo. To make them accept, adapt to the colonization status quo, we must take out the hope. We must have this iron wall that deprives them of any hope. So instilling hope, nourishing hope, is a humanizing tool. Rejects the colonization of the mind by trying to decolonize the mind. The third concept that's very important, and sometimes activists forget it, that we're in this business to mobilize effective, strategic, goal-oriented action. In other words, our eyes are always on the ball. What do we want to achieve? It's not enough to try hard. Yeah, you've done a good job, you tried hard. We're not in it to just try hard. We're in it to succeed. And therefore, we have to be very good activists, very strategic activists, very educated, very accurate, and so on. So it's not enough to be ethical. It's not enough to work on our minds, decolonizing our minds. It's also very important to be strategic and to be extremely effective. With that, I will introduce what we've done in the BDS movement since 2005 till now, in those last 10 years, very, very briefly, and then open up some challenges that we face, especially in this country. The BDS call, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions call, which was issued on July 9th, 2005 by the absolute majority of Palestinians in the occupied territories, inside Israel, as well as in exile, specified 3 basic rights without which Palestinians cannot exercise our inalienable right to self-determination. Ending the occupation of 67, including the wall, the colonies, ending Israel's system of racial discrimination, which meets the United Nations definition of apartheid. Third, the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And we focused on all 3 rights, not just ending the occupation, because Palestinians are not just those living in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. Only 38% of the Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza. 12% are Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, and 50% are Palestinians in exile, denied their right to go home because they're the wrong type. So as a human rights movement, we had to focus on the basic rights of all 3 Palestinian constituencies. Some soft, liberal Zionists do not like that. They say, oh, we must have a Zionist BDS. Some call it a kosher BDS. A kosher BDS means only against the occupation, which is a strange concept because the last time we checked the UN roster, there was no country called the occupation. Our occupation has a name, and its name is Israel. So even if one were only concerned about human rights of the 38% of the Palestinians, they would consider isolating Israel in order to end that occupation, let alone apartheid and let alone the rights of refugees. Now, so our basic rights are not negotiable because they're basic. They're UN stipulated rights. What's very negotiable, what's very nuanced, is the second part of the BDS call, which is the action. What to do to achieve those rights, the boycotting, divesting, and eventually imposing sanctions. As a movement inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, by the civil rights movement in the United States, but there's no copy-paste, though. Inspired means we understand from that heritage certain lessons, but we adapt them to our particularities. But one thing we understand very well is that internal resistance must be coupled with consistent and very persistent external pressure to isolate the regime. The regime is a concept we're increasingly using. I've always used it, but it's very important to discuss that because sometimes they tell you, you want to boycott Israel, that you want to destroy it then. You want to destroy Israel. And this destruction sounds, it evokes memories of the Holocaust, and it evokes very bloody memories. Strange to accuse a nonviolent movement of wanting to destroy anything, but anyway, as I've argued elsewhere, if freedom, justice, and equality, the 3 points that we raise in the BDS movement, would destroy Israel, what does that say about Israel? If Israel's existence is conditioned upon maintaining a regime of inequality, injustice, what does that say about Israel? So we want to isolate that regime. We want to end the existence of that regime of oppression. We do not want to destroy anyone. We do not want to kill any human. We're not in the killing business. It's Israel that is very much in the killing business, as well as your country, of course, the expert in the killing business. So since 2005 until now, the BDS movement has achieved quite a lot. In fact, much beyond what we had expected when we launched it in 2005. In the last couple of years, we started to see some economic impact on Israel. So beyond the initial successes in the academic boycott and the arts cultural boycott, we started to see an economic impact. Although, of course, the cultural boycott, as you've seen with the Lauryn Hill cancellation, is still big news. It's still front page news. And we thank Lauryn Hill for canceling. But it's the economic impact that hurts the most and that gets Israel's attention the most. So since June 2013, Israel shifted responsibility for fighting BDS from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which handles the so-called Iranian threat, relations with the United States. So it's nice to be on par with Iran as a threat, but a bit exaggerated. But I think it points to the fact that Israel, despite its massive power, its nuclear weapons, its endless support from the United States, Congress, Europeans, and so on, is still very vulnerable to a human rights movement that's nonviolent. Israel's system, structure, has not been designed to face such nonviolent challenges. Soft power hits Israel's Achilles heel. They just don't know what to do with us. So, and I've said this before, when the Presbyterian Church in 2014 passed divestment against HP, Caterpillar, and Motorola Solutions, what could Israel have done? Bomb the Presbyterian Church? Because that's what they do normally. They have F-16s, any problem, they bomb it away. What can you do with the Presbyterian Church? Or when Bill Gates divested from G4S, bomb Bill Gates? So, I mean, we're testing the limits of Israel's power with our soft power. So economic impact, academic boycott, cultural boycott growing, the isolation is growing to the extent that Shabtai Shavit, the former Mossad chief for several years in Israel, admitted that BDS is the second most critical and strategic threat facing Israel today, Israel's regime of oppression today. And one important factor he raised, Shabtai Shavit, in his analysis of this threat is Jewish support for BDS. He mentioned this very, very clearly, that Jewish support for BDS is growing, and that's extremely alarming to Israel. This whole myth, Bush Jr., of us versus them, Jews versus the world hates us meaning Jews, is collapsing with this growth of Jewish support for BDS in particular, and of course Jewish Israeli support as well. Thus, the anti-boycott law in Israel that was passed in 2011 and was upheld by the Israeli High Court just a couple of weeks ago. Although the number of Jewish Israelis supporting BDS is still small, clearly Israel's regime feels it is extremely critical, this minority, because it's shattering this myth of the us versus them. It's showing that this conflict, quote unquote, is not between two symmetric parties. It's not between husband and wife, so to speak. It's not a domestic dispute. It's between colonizer and colonized. And it's either you support colonialism, apartheid, and occupation, or you're against it. It has nothing to do with identity. It's a non-sectarian issue. And as a human rights movement, we always address this issue. We're non-sectarian, we're inclusive, and we oppose all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. That's very much at the core of our philosophy and what we do. So, given this very brief history, Israel has identified, as of February 2014, in a supposedly secret meeting of the Israeli government, they shifted gears. Looking at BDS as a strategic threat and assigning responsibility for fighting it to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, they decided that the Brand Israel campaign, which was Israel's chief response to BDS, especially the academic and cultural boycott, was no longer working, was not effective. They reached that conclusion, and they decided that they've got to adopt a new strategy based on three basic points. Increased espionage, especially in the West, against BDS activists and BDS networks, delegitimizing BDS through legal means, passing legislation in Congress, Canadian Parliament, Australian Parliament, all settler colonies, coincidentally, and others, to try to make it illegal to advocate for BDS or to support BDS campaigning. And the third point is increased funding for more propaganda. So they're continuing with Brand Israel, but they're adopting a legal warfare, a lawfare against BDS. That's the new, the most important strategy that Israel has adopted since last year. And we're seeing that with the US Congress legislation and so on. Of course, the anti-Semitism charge will continue. The singling out Israel will continue. We'll continue to hear that, and I'll answer that in a minute. But it's extremely important. Another development that happened in the last year or so, building bridges between the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the Black Consciousness Movement, the Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, and so on in this country. Ferguson to Gaza has become a very important link that is growing. And we've always thought that BDS should be looked upon in that context of universal human rights. Quite often in New York, it becomes a Jewish issue. And we've always argued we've got to look at BDS outside the Jewish box. It's not a Jewish issue. It's an issue of justice. It's an issue of human rights. So everyone, including Jews, should be involved in it. It's not a purely Jewish issue, and it should never be turned into a purely Jewish issue. It's bad for Palestinians, and it's bad for Jewish communities, as it promotes anti-Semitism with this Jewish exceptionalism. About singling out Israel, and I'll stop there. There are several answers to this, and I'll end with that. When Rosa Parks triggered the civil rights boycott against the Montgomery Bus Company over its racial discrimination policies, was the US civil rights movement singling out of that company hypocritical? As it was certainly not the most heinous company in the world. There were so many other companies committing horrible crimes in Mexico and other places around the world. As Desmond Tutu also said, when they called for boycotting South African apartheid, it wasn't because South African apartheid was the absolute worst regime on earth. There were other regimes in Africa and elsewhere that were committing worse crimes than the South African apartheid regime. But it's their oppressor. They had to call for boycotting their oppressor. There's no singling out in that sense. Another important point is that the United States has singled out Israel, showering it with billions of dollars, protecting it from censure at the United Nations and elsewhere, and so on. The United States has singled out Israel, and therefore we are responding to this singling out. We want Israel to be taken off the pedestal and to be treated like every other country that commits similar crimes. Not better and not worse. It is, as I said, our direct oppressor. Its companies, its complicit institutions are our direct oppressor, and therefore we must start with boycotting it. And as human rights defenders and activists, we have limited resources, and we cannot invest them strategically to boycott the whole world of oppression. We cannot do that. We've got to work with other communities in their own struggles. If you're suffering from the flu and you fight the flu, it's not because it's the worst disease there is. I'm sure cancer and AIDS and many others are much worse. But that's what's afflicting you. You have the flu. So you've got to take medicine for the flu, not for cancer or AIDS. Finally, as Naomi Klein said, a boycott of the US, for example, as we always hear in this country, why aren't you calling for a boycott of the United States? Wouldn't work. Even if we wanted to, it would not work. The United States is too hegemonic, too powerful to be affected by a boycott. So as human rights activists, we want to reach impact, as I said. It's very important to reach goals. To reach goals, to have impact, you've got to start where you can have a difference. You can make a difference. Thus, BDS. Thus, calling for a boycott, divestment, sanctions, not just against Israel's regime and its institutions, against international corporations, US, international, European, Arab, Israeli companies involved in violating our human rights. Finally, 10 years after BDS, we have a lot of hope. We are approaching our South Africa moment, and as Ehud Barak, the most decorated general in Israel's history, has admitted, we are reaching a tipping point. Thank you.